recording. So welcome to our session today on the trauma-informed and anti-racist writing classroom with Sonya Bilocerkowycz. Sonya is a lecturer of English and Creating Writing at SUNY Geneseo. She is the author of On Our Way Home from the Revolution, which won the Gournay Prize for a debut essay collection that was published in 2019 by Ohio State University Press. Sonya is managing editor of the Journal of Speculative Nonfiction, and her essays and poems have appeared in Literary Hub, Colorado Review, Guernica, Ninth Letter, and elsewhere. Today's session is part of our month-long celebration honoring Black History Month as part of our efforts of becoming an anti-racist college. These series of events and sessions are planned and organized by the Anti-Racism and DEI Subcommittee of the President's Diversity Commission, and will hopefully spark discussions, reflections, and actions as we work towards this vision of anti-racism. For more information, please feel free to check out the entire list that I'm pasting in the chat here. You can find all of our sessions on Black History Month via that link. And before we begin, we ask that all of our participants mute your mics during the session. We do encourage you to use the chat feature to provide questions for Sonya. We've allotted time at the end for a Q&A. We just ask that all questions and comments are grounded in respect, with no disrespect towards the presenter, moderator, or any other participants. So with that, I will turn it over to Sonya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate this. Thanks everyone for being here. As Dave said, my name is Sonya Bilocerkowycz. I've been on faculty here at Geneseo since the fall of 2019. And I was just thinking how strange it is that I've actually passed the mark where I've now been sort of remote from campus for longer than I was on campus, which is a bit sad. And I'm really, missing being on campus with everyone. So though I will be leading our conversation today, this work has grown out of a collaboration with my colleagues in creative writing, including professors Kristen Gentry, Rachel Hall, Carolyn Bels-Hosek, Lytton Smith, and Jess Fenn as part of a TLC faculty innovation grant. So shout out to my colleagues. Those of you that are here, feel free to interject at any point or offer clarifications or add to something that I've said. I want to give just a little bit of background about how this project started. So we began this project in response to something that occasionally happens in our creative writing classrooms, which is that students submit what I will just call with a blanket term, difficult material. In some cases, for example, a student might reveal information in their work about a traumatic experience they've had, and then the task is for the instructor and the students to respond to that material. In other cases, difficult material might involve a student whose work suggests or, in the worst case scenario, even promotes violence, racism, xenophobia, etc. These situations, of course, are concerning for lots of reasons, one of them being the potential harm that this work could cause to other students or to the instructor. So with the support of the TLC, we decided to gather and study these issues together as a program. As we dug into the material, our focus kind of shifted from this question of how should we react to our students when they submit difficult material, and toward two other questions, which really front load the work of creating a safe environment for all learners. Those questions are, what makes a writing classroom trauma-informed upfront, and what makes a writing classroom genuinely inclusive or anti-racist? So today I'd like to share with you some of the findings from our study, though I also would like to note upfront that I do not consider myself an expert per se in either of these areas. So please feel free to interject, provide, points of clarification or pushback or ask questions during the process of this presentation. I really want to be transparent about the fact that I am approaching you all as an educator who is still very much in the middle of the learning process herself. I envision this presentation as really just a starting point for further discussion, And I hope that being candid about my own learning process might in turn be beneficial for others. So I'm going to start with this sort of first question about sort of what makes a trauma-informed writing classroom or just classroom in general. As part of our faculty innovation grant, we started by inviting Professor Catherine Standifer to join us at Geneseo for a day-long workshop on trauma-informed writing pedagogy. Professor Standifer is herself a nonfiction writer and an expert in trauma writing. As we gathered, sort of our first point of business was to talk about and learn ourselves what trauma actually is. For me personally, I had sort of a vague sense of this word, right? I hear this word all the time, but I didn't have any understanding myself of sort of the physiological implications of trauma. Professor Catherine Standifer talked with us about how trauma is not so much an event as it is a physiological process in the body. This is important because two people might experience the exact same event, and one person might have a trauma response to the event while the other person does not. For the sake of a very, very brief overview, I'll just tell you sort of my elementary understanding of what happens to the brain when trauma is experienced. So when a person is trauma exposed, the sympathetic nervous system engages a quick and automatic defensive mechanism for protection. This occurs down in the amygdala. This is the part of the brain associated with the sort of fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard about before. Again, this cue kind of happens in the amygdala, and my understanding is that this is an older part of the human brain. When we're experiencing this kind of threatening event, the amygdala basically takes over and we sort of lose access to our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain associated with rational thought, with reasoning, with self-control, with language, meaning making, and writing. Professor Standifer noted that in these situations, our body is trying to help us, that this response is normal, even if maybe it doesn't feel that way at the time. So what does this mean for our classrooms and for our students? Well, when a student who has been previously trauma exposed is quote unquote triggered in the classroom, their amygdala is cued and their body actually thinks that they are experiencing the traumatic event again. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated and students are experiencing this kind of stress response, they may become defensive or aggressive. They may have trouble focusing, trouble with short-term memory. They could also experience sweating, heart rate increase, and just generally sort of unpleasant symptoms. Again, when this happens, our students are also losing access to their prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that engages in reasoning and writing, these tasks that are really important for the work we're asking them to do as students. And I just want to pause here for a minute and say that I think I had not previously really considered trauma as it relates to my teaching, in part because I felt that these issues were just simply not relevant to the intellectual work that was occurring in my classroom. And I realize now that to some degree I was kind of teaching to an imaginary student, right? Because I didn't really understand sort of how the brain actually works. Even just having this very rudimentary understanding now of the interplay between the sympathetic nervous system and these sort of more executive cognitive functions has shifted how I approach my role as an educator. I accept that it is important for me to assist students as best I can in sort of regaining access to their prefrontal cortex if a stress response has caused them to become deregulated. And I should say that doesn't necessarily mean that every educator should or will come to that same conclusion, only that for me, this framework makes a lot of sense in terms of a way to better understand and support my students. So what are some trauma-informed strategies that we can adopt in our classrooms? And I've put together this list really hoping that it applies regardless of discipline, and I think it does. Well, we want to keep in mind our sort of being aware of the ability to continually ground ourselves and our students in the present moment and in our bodies. This can help us to stay regulated during a class session, for example. So here are some ideas that you could share with students to that end. Inviting students to write, free write for 5 minutes and describe the room that they are sitting in. Or similarly, describe another person in the room. This might make most sense in a face-to-face context in which they can sort of write about their classmates. Again, these activities help to sort of ground the student in their present moment and pay attention to their body and their immediate surroundings. Another technique that I like is called the 5 senses technique. This is where if you start to feel that you're having a stress response, you pause, identify 5 things around you, 4 that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things in your vicinity that you can hear, 2 things you can smell, etc. Professor Standifer really recommended having snacks on hand, inviting students to bring snacks or bringing snacks for them, that eating can sort of keep us grounded and regulated. Also, she recommended providing items that students can hold, things like, rocks or crystals or stress balls, something to sort of engage their hands while the intellectual work is happening. Another tip that Professor Standifer passed on to us was that if you put your hand on your heart, this pretty immediately releases oxytocin, and oxytocin is associated with a calming effect. So that can be helpful if a student is experiencing a stress response. She also recommended, if you're feeling stressed out, to try moving your eyes back and forth. And this sort of helps to remind the body that there is not an immediate threat. And again, it sort of regulates and sort of pulls you out of the amygdala if you start to feel yourself slipping down into that part of the brain. Deep breaths and breathing exercises, being aware of the breath. This is one that's, I think, pretty sort of commonly known and shared. And I think it's important, though, if you are interested in maybe sharing some of these techniques with students, noting that not every technique is necessarily going to work for every student in every situation. This isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all list. I was actually talking with my sister about this the other day, and she's had some issues with her lungs in the past. And she told me that whenever people tell her to take deep breaths, it actually really stresses her out. So I would say that would, for example, not be a good strategy for her to use. So again, if you share these ideas with students, really thinking about them as sort of needing to be tailored to individual students' needs. Other things that I've been talking about with students are just stretching, sort of making time in class for stretching, inviting students to stretch, or modeling sort of stretching and taking a break and moving around. Professor Standifer also sort of impressed upon us how important it is just to affirm students when they are having a kind of stress response or a trauma response, letting them know and reminding them that this is normal, your body is acting in a totally normal way, and that there's nothing wrong with what's happening. Another important point, something that I've been thinking about, is this idea of procrastination as a form of protection. So it might be worth being aware as an educator that if a student is procrastinating, perhaps there is an opportunity there to engage with the student and think about sort of, what might be going on why the procrastination is sort of a response in this case. I also wanted to share, I know that Dr. Beth Collette here at Geneseo works with faculty to create mindfulness sessions that can be tailored to your classroom and your needs. I haven't had the opportunity to take advantage of this myself, but I'm sure there are also a lot of other great resources on campus that I'm not yet aware of, but this sounds like a really, really excellent opportunity. I personally, last semester, I taught asynchronously and did not have a very sort of natural way to introduce this material to students. But this semester, I'm teaching synchronous online courses, and I've already been sort of talking with students about how the brain works, talking about the fact that COVID-19, the pandemic we're living through, this is very, very stressful. Some of us might, be experiencing trauma for various reasons associated with the pandemic. And I've been offering them these, strategies and techniques to use if they wish. And I wanted to just pause here for a moment and invite the participants and see if any of you have techniques that you've used in your classrooms or ideas that you would like to share, things that you or your students have found effective in terms of staying regulated. And feel free to just unmute and talk because I can't see all of you.
Anybody have any ideas that they would like to share? These are all great strategies, Sonya, And I made some comments in the chat too that we, they're great techniques actually for faculty and staff too, not just student. They, like you said, they can be used by any student in any type of class. They are probably techniques that are more important now than ever. I'm really glad that you mentioned Beth Chalette in as assistant director of the counseling services. She has offered some TLC sessions in the past on incorporating mindfulness in the classroom. We are going to be doing more of those in the TLC, probably starting in March. I'd like to put a link to a resource in the chat here. This is what Beth has come up with for coping with COVID. It is meant for students, but there is a tab in there for some specific techniques, to really help you be mindful in this time. Many of the things that you've mentioned there, Sonya. So just wanted to add that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, I was going to mention later that I know you've also shared some work. The TLC has Dr. Mays Ahmad, who's a neurologist who does a lot of work with the trauma-informed pedagogy. And she really emphasizes this idea that like, it's difficult to engage in this kind of teaching with your students if you as an educator are not sort of familiar with your own support systems and sort of your own coping strategies. So we're definitely not, at a remove from any of this. This all totally applies to us in the same way. I think that is really important. So thanks for bringing that up, Dave. Super. Well, I'm going to keep moving on then. I have one slide here. This is a little bit more specific to sort of the writing classroom. Though I suspect that students probably share maybe personal or even traumatic details about their lives across disciplines, particularly I would guess in the humanities or social sciences. So I'm just going to spend one slide talking about this in case it's of interest to some folks, and we can come back to it, during the Q&A. But there's been many studies, I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, including Dr. James Pennebaker's really famous 1986 research that suggests that engaging in expressive writing about personal, difficult issues or situations can actually result in health benefits. There's also reason to believe that there is some limit to positive effects of writing about trauma. So if a student writes about a traumatic event, for example, very quickly after that event occurs, the writing process might end up being more damaging to them than helpful. A good question to ask students who might be interested in sort of engaging with this material is that since we understand that writing about trauma can cause a bodily effect, are we in a good position to deal with what that effect might be on our bodies? A 2002 study by researchers Ulrich and Lutgendorf suggests that writing about trauma without a focus on meaning making can result in worse physical health outcomes. I believe in their study, they noted that students who were writing about trauma and just writing about emotions and not sort of making that next step, that sort of cognitive step into assigning meaning to those events, started to develop more cold symptoms. So they were actually sort of like getting sick as they were writing about those sort of emotionally fraught situations. Professor Catherine Standifer, when she was here visiting us at Geneseo, she suggested a titration method, wherein if students wish to write emotionally fraught material, they do so in small doses, basically so that they can come back out of the limbic brain, sort of like how close can you get to the situation and still be able to pull yourself out. So always being able to continually sort of regulate and not kind of slide down into the amygdala. She suggested some things that might be helpful, such as like isolating a small set of details associated with the memory, or even describing the setting of the event rather than sort of writing directly into the heart of the trauma. She also presented ideas such as maybe encouraging students to find a new framework or a new sort of narrative point of view with which to approach the event. Basically, just trying to interact with that event in a fresh way so that you don't automatically kind of slide back onto that trauma groove or that pattern that your brain has established. So really thinking about new approaches, new frameworks for sort of dealing with that situation or that material. Let's see. Next, I have just one slide here about content and trigger warnings. I wanted to say a quick word about these because they are such a hot button issue. I mean, we kind of hear about them all the time. There hasn't really been a lot of research done on the benefits or a lot of sort of formal scientific research. Some psychologists suggest that giving content warnings when a student or when you're presenting material that might have, you know, sort of traumatic events or scenes described in them, that these can help students control their intake of material, particularly students with PTSD, while some other researchers are concerned that these content or trigger warnings could actually elevate student anxiety levels. So there's sort of, you know, quite a discussion going on still in the field. For this particular reason, Professor Catherine Standifer indicated to us that she actually does not use content warnings in her courses. She explained that the thing which might be triggering to a student could actually be quite difficult to determine or control for. For example, like a smell maybe that's associated with a particular memory. She suggested instead of content warnings that a student who is triggered by course material receive reassurance that their feelings are valid and have these options for deregulating up front sort of in the class, and that they have options for sort of holding space, and again, just that they're affirmed. All that to say that I personally actually have been using content warnings more regularly since Professor Standifer visited us at Geneseo, in part because I just decided that this year especially, I really wanted students to have as much information up front before they're diving into their homework assignments. But as you can see, this is really a fluid and sort of ongoing conversation. And I think the big takeaway is just it's a good reminder that content warnings alone won't necessarily help every student. And so it may be just advisable to sort of consider them as one part of a more holistic trauma-informed pedagogy. When Professor Standifer was here, she said, "Writing problems have never been divorced from spiritual problems." As one of my colleagues reflected after our workshop, "I've always been aware that my work as a creative writing professor is deeply connected to the students' inner lives and conflicts, but hearing Standifer say this brought that reality to the forefront. I have also always understood this to be true on sort of a philosophical level, and I understand now that it's true as well on a physiological level, given how our brain works to protect the body from threats or perceived threats. And because of the way the brain works, I would go so far as to say that these problems do not just or exclusively apply to creative material, but in fact to a lot of written work that our students may be submitting." So this paradigm shift for me has, I think, just sort of made me a bit more empathetic and flexible, and it has given me a framework for understanding my students' efforts in a more holistic context. And as I was sort of saying earlier, Dave, this also just helped me personally with, you know, writing problems that I have encountered, whether in my own research or my creative work. And so I think it's really important for us to consider, you know, what support systems we have in place, and sort of understanding our own regulating strategies as well. All right, so that's sort of the first pillar of this presentation. And I'm going to shift gears here to sort of the second pillar of what our TLC grant project discussed. And then I'm sort of going to connect it all at the end. We also, in conjunction with studying trauma, our faculty group sought to deepen our thinking on anti-racist pedagogy. Our discussions were primarily informed by these two texts, David Mura's A Stranger's Journey and Janelle Adseat's Toward an Inclusive Creative Writing. Although I would actually love to host a very long session on this topic, I'm going to keep this section a bit briefer as the work was sort of highly specific to our discipline. I have decided to frame this section as a case study, which I hope will encourage listeners to consider how comparable issues might present themselves in your disciplines. And I'll be asking for your reflections on that later in the presentation. So to start, I think I need to provide some background context on the Iowa workshop model, which is a pedagogical model most associated with creative writing instruction in the United States. The Writers' Workshop was founded in 1936 at the University of Iowa, and it used a workshop-based pedagogy wherein basically students would submit their creative work ahead of time whether they were short stories or poems. The instructor and the class would read the work and they would gather together for a critique session, during which time the class would talk about the work and share their impressions while the writer remained silent. The proliferation of programs based on this model, I think there are like 300 plus MFA programs in the US now, corresponds to a belief that writing can be taught. This pedagogy is often spoken of in terms of craft being the tools or techniques a creative writer uses to make their art, sometimes also defined simply as the decisions a writer makes. However, what is not often spoken about are the implicit and explicit aesthetic preferences that the teaching of craft tends to assume. These principles are frequently taught as universal truths about what makes writing good or bad, with little recognition of the power structures undergirding those assumptions. The photo here is of the poet Rita Dove, who attended the Iowa workshop in the 1970s. At the time, she was the only Black student in the program. She's quoted as saying that being a student in a creative writing workshop is a very naked experience, and as the only person representing any other culture, you're setting yourself up doubly. The Iowa workshop model was made for and by white male writers, and many writers of color have reported experiences of racism at the workshop. So that was some background that I felt like was necessary for our field to sort of get that out of the way. But now I want to talk about how this sort of absolutist claims about craft play out. And I want to use just sort of one example as a case study. This is the craft maxim, show, don't tell, which is possibly something that you have heard before, whether or not you have spent time in a creative writing classroom. Show, don't tell is the idea that it is preferable for the actions of characters and plot events to be dramatized rather than explained to a reader. This maxim also insinuates, though I think it's a bit more subtle, that our stories, for example, should not be didactic, that they shouldn't tell us what to believe or sort of tell us what the moral is. And by extension, I think it also implies that art should not be didactic. Even when I teach a 100 or a 200 level introductory writing course, students will come into my classroom armed with this phrase and ready to say this to each other and give this to each other as advice. This idea, show, don't tell, is frequently taught as universal, and it's something just very commonly heard in a creative writing workshop setting. But when we stop to question sort of the history or the implications of a craft maxim like this one, I think it's interesting to see how they just don't always hold up that well to scrutiny. The author Sonya Huber discusses in an article for LitHub how damaging this maxim was for her as a writer and as a person while she was in an abusive relationship. She basically describes that she was collecting these scenes of what was happening to her, but she couldn't talk about her situation in a voice that felt alive or animated. She was sort of almost like watching the events happen to her. She goes on to say that this maxim perpetuates the silencing of the abused, stating that for some of our students, don't tell repeats the abuse they will have endured along with its highest commandment, secrecy. In a New York Times article, writer Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about writers of color entering these historically white and sometimes hostile creative writing workshop spaces. They write, "We come as refugees and immigrants, documented and undocumented. We come from the ghettos, barrios, reservations, and borders of America where there are no workshops. And we come with the desire not just to show, but to tell." The writer Namrata Padar contends that show, don't tell is a colonial relic, positing that many non-Western and non-white writers will give preference to oral storytelling over a site-based approach to storytelling. Orality here, Padar writes, becomes a political stance, an ideological move reminding the reader over and again that what we consume as universal in storycraft, literary history, or aesthetic taste is anything but universal. So what I think these points of criticism here reveal is that the directive show, don't tell relies on the assumption of a particular kind of writer and a particular kind of reader, both of whom are white, who are probably middle class, probably male, and who exist in a Western context. Creative writing craft rules, so to speak, are culturally contingent, and it is a failure of our discipline that they are not always taught as such. Indeed, this kind of false transcendence, as Claudia Rankine refers to it, is one way that white supremacy is upheld, and it actively harms Black, Indigenous, and students of color. So with that in mind, how can we foster an anti-racist writing classroom, one that understands craft as culturally contingent? Geneseo creative writing faculty have adopted many practices, both prior to and as a result of this study over the past year. These practices seek to empower student writers and especially students of color as autonomous artists. I'm going to use the pronoun we to refer to practices that have been adopted by one or more faculty members, even if I'm not the particular faculty member who has adopted that practice. So here are some of the things we're doing. We teach, or we have conversations with our students about the fact that craft is culturally contingent, and we include that language on our syllabi. We have unsilenced the traditional workshop, encouraging the writer to be in direct dialogue with those people who are reading their piece. This actively disrupts the power dynamic established through the white-centric Iowa model. We've also given the writer an opportunity to begin the conversation about their workshop piece, to pose questions or explain aspects of their creative work up front that they would like readers to engage with. In other cases, we've done away with the traditional workshop model altogether, opting for an online feedback forum that occurs over an extended timeline. We've instituted author's notes to accompany creative submissions, wherein student writers are invited to explain their composition process and the rationale behind their particular craft choices. This gives them practice in articulating how their craft is connected to their cultural or social position and to their intended audiences. In giving feedback, we have also reframed the question of sort of what's working well in this story, what's not working, to instead ask about risks and possibilities. As Janelle Adsit writes, thinking in terms of what a craft choice may risk and what it makes possible shifts the conversation away from absolutist claims about what is right or wrong in literary craft. In giving feedback, we've also switched to a model that invites students to pose questions. Questions that lead the writer to deeper thought about the addressed issue or craft element and are not supposed to be suggestions disguised as questions. So for example, rather than asking, have you thought about cutting the boyfriend character from the story, asking instead, what is the boyfriend's role in this story? Which prompts the writer to consider their original intentions and other options for that character. This reflection may indeed lead to the boyfriend character being cut, but it does so without inhibiting possibilities for the writer. Another important development is that we have relaxed some program restrictions against so-called genre fiction, things like sci-fi or fantasy writing, as there were concerns that students might be limited by curriculum that privileges realism or so-called literary fiction as the sole metric of good writing. This is an ongoing conversation for us as a program as we consider how we can effectively teach or discuss literary conventions that may be outside of sort of our own areas of expertise. We've also compiled a Canvas course shell on inclusive creative writing pedagogy. It's full of resources on topics such as authorship, representation, and resistance. And we'd be happy to grant access to others if folks are interested in seeing some of those resources. These are just a few of the pedagogical adjustments that we've been making as a program and will continue to build on in the semesters ahead. In A Stranger's Journey, writer David Mura addresses students of color directly and affirms the experiences that many of them have had in predominantly white workshops. Though in this quote, he's talking to graduate students, I think it can apply to undergrads as well. Students of color, you are not misinterpreting what is before you and around you. You are in hostile territory. You are in a battle. In many MFA programs, your presence, your mind, and your creativity represent an alien presence at odds with the powers that be. So something that I've come to understand in a deeper way through this study over the last year is that it is not actually possible for my classroom to be trauma-informed without it also being anti-racist, precisely because the perpetuation of racist structures and racist assumptions is traumatic for our students of color. There are numerous ways in which the pedagogy that I learned from my mentors and they learned from their mentors and so on has been replicated without a serious interrogation of the power dynamics or values latent in that curriculum. And I believe it is imperative to dismantle those hierarchies as quickly as possible. There's truly just so much more to talk about on this subject, but I'm going to stop here for now. And I would like to open up the floor for conversation. I'm curious to know if any of you have identified areas within your own discipline, or maybe are in the process of sort of identifying areas that reproduce white supremacist or other harmful hierarchies. How have you changed or are in the process of changing your curricular approach to resist those hierarchies? I'm actually going to stop sharing screen too. The only thing left on this PowerPoint is a list of resources, and I'm happy to provide this for anyone who might be interested.
Thank you very much, Sonya. That was very helpful. And if you are be willing to share your slides, we could put those up with the recording of this as well.
I'd be happy to do that, sure.
So with that, let's open it up for questions and discussions. Feel free to turn on your camera and turn on your microphone and ask a question directly, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put something in the chat as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question that came up as you were giving your presentation, Sonya. So you were talking a lot in the beginning about those trauma-informed practices and how we can help our students and ourselves be more mindful and in the moment in the classroom. So I'm wondering, when you are reading student writing, a lot of times, some of these traumatic experiences that you're reading about, you're not going to be in the classroom with the student. So what has your group thought about as far as appropriate ways to respond? How can you help those students when they are not necessarily in the moment and in the classroom?
For sure. I mean, it's sort of hard to, I guess, give one answer because every student is different, every piece of writing is different, every classroom community is unique. I guess for me personally, I have tried to, when a student submits something that you can tell is just really emotionally fraught, and you might even notice that in terms of the writing itself, it's demonstrating sort of like a trauma response in the sense that the writing might be really fragmented, structurally, very fragmented, for example. I personally like to reach out to that student directly and just say, hey, like, I really appreciate you, bringing this writing into the, to the workshop, into the classroom. Thank you for this opportunity to read it. Just wanted, let me know if you need any access to resources. Also, you don't have to respond to this email if you don't want to. I don't want to assume, I guess, that students necessarily are looking for help, and really it might just be a question of like, we need to think more about how craft is playing out here and like why this voice is so sort of like, why this piece feels so emotionally fraught, and what that tone or voice might be accomplishing in the piece. So I have sort of a practice in place of reaching out to students directly when it feels like that might be a concern or an issue. I wonder if other faculty members in the department have, I don't know, thoughts about this as well.
I'll just say it's something I want to think about. I don't have a good solution at the moment, but I think it's a really important question. And so I plan to give it some thought and to talk to other folks who may have hit on some strategies. I will definitely look into that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Paul. One thing that Professor Standiford talked about in her presentation that I thought was really useful was if a student happens to express interest to you ahead of time that they want to write about maybe something that's like difficult material, that there are, questions you can work through with the student to that end. She had this great metaphor that she used, which is like a compost metaphor. Basically the idea that experiences you've had that have had time to process are probably going to produce more fertile writing than those sort of like very recent experiences, which are on the top of the compost heap and maybe need a little more time. You might need some more time and space away from those things before you can sort of dive into them. That sort of analogy can be useful in terms of working with students. And I've already used it, several times in conversations with students who've expressed to me, that they want to write about something, really difficult from their personal life.
Am I talking? I can't tell. No, I'm mute.
You are. Yeah, you are.
I'm talking. Okay.
Hi, Rachel.
I mean, I knew I was talking, but you know what I mean. Could you hear me? Yeah, I think that, Sonya, first of all, thank you. This is so great. And you've just pulled everything together so beautifully. I think the difficulty often is that we don't know, right, that a student is having an experience of trauma while they're reading a piece of literature or, responding to someone else's work. I think it's easier maybe to catch that ahead of time, right? And I've said, I haven't used the compost metaphor, but I'm glad you reminded me of it because it is so useful. But I have said to students in the past, are you sure you're ready to write about that now? Like they'll say, this just happened and I've got to write about it. And sometimes they go ahead and do that, even though you've said, are you sure, and then sometimes they can't end those pieces if we're talking about, like a story or a poem or a short essay, because they don't have that distance from it. So that's one of the things that now I would think to add, which is maybe go ahead and write a draft of this, but probably without time away from it. You may not be able to finish it in the way that it will, its final form. So.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Sonya, go right ahead.
No, go.
I was just going to say, it seems like from a both and point of view too, that there may be some benefits to writing about an experience immediately, but then it's a different type of writing. It's a different type of writing or processing than you might have, in using the compost metaphor, when you've been able to really process it for a while and, reflect on that experience and what it may mean. So there may be different types of writing there.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. I mean, when I was talking about sort of like Dr. Pennebaker's work, a lot of those researchers are talking about just expressive writing, journaling, like stream of consciousness kind of writing, which we usually do distinguish that from sort of like the work that's being produced in, for example, an advanced creative nonfiction workshop, that work is, crafted differently. I still think it is interesting to consider the ways that like that expressive writing might eventually lead to a more crafted piece, in the future. So I thought it was important to sort of talk about all of that here, writing sort of generally, but you're absolutely right, Dave. Like there's not, we're talking about several different things for sure.
Sonya, have you and the others who've contributed to the Canvas course shell thought about putting it in the Canvas Commons? Even just there's a broad Canvas Commons where anybody who uses Canvas can find materials that have been put there, but there's also just a Geneseo Canvas Commons where it can be seen by anybody at Geneseo, but not people beyond. And it might be a way of getting more people aware of it rather than simply relying on people to reach out and ask to have access.
That is a great idea. I believe that did come up at one point during one of our conversations, but I'm so glad that you reminded us of it.
Lori Fox can help you.
Super. I will talk
if you're interested in doing it. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Actually, Jess Fenn put together the bulk of the Canvas page. So I'll talk to Jess about that. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. Absolutely. Thumbs up.
I also just wanted to say as a comment that I love the slogan, "Craft is culturally contingent," and it resonates with me, and I suspect for Jess as well in this meeting, as somebody whose specialty is in a period before the 20th century. So show don't tell is a classic, it's a sort of Jamesian aesthetic, right? That comes to dominate. And so it's in the contemporary classroom, its dominance reflects the fact that the people who have adopted it are people in a position of power and privilege, white males, right? But there was a time when white males did not adhere to the show don't tell aesthetic. And it's just actually, as a Victorianist, the idea of opening up craft to didacticism, of course, is it's wonderful to hear. And at my late stage in my career, it's refreshing, but it's amusing in a way after having taught for decades under the cloud of, oh, those Victorians, they're always moralizing, right? Jess, I'm sure, could talk not just about literary aesthetic, but how in the visual arts, perspective came to be the dominant mode and requirement in art, and the cycles too through which a craft that was viewed at one time as inferior then comes to be celebrated again. Pre-Raphaelite artists in the 19th century, and then modernists go back to some of these earlier aesthetics. And so that's a personal note, but also I see in your teaching that slogan the opportunity both to draw on what students may have encountered in some of their other classes, if they've taken a medieval lit class, if they've taken a Victorian lit class, and the opportunity to change how maybe, if I didn't succeed in a Victorian lit class in getting students to understand that, your mind should be open to this aesthetic other than the one you've always assumed is the right one, then the creative writing class can be another place that opens their mind to how culturally contingent in all sorts of ways. And it's always pegged, of course, to who are the people who have power and privilege in the moment.
I think that is an excellent point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Paul. As I was researching more and I've been thinking about this more the last few months. I was reading some of the history of the program at Iowa, and the program founders were very explicit about the political project and the political context of why they were starting this program. And right, CIA money just said in the chat. Yeah, it was a program to establish and support artists who were going to exhibit individualism and democracy, right? It was like an anti-communist sort of project, basically. So even though, we sort of view the proliferation of the programs that have grown out of that model, we have to assume, are not separate from the political project that was happening there in the 1930s. And that's just an excellent point to put it even, Paul, in much larger sort of historical context, and how the pendulum just sort of swings back and forth. Sounds like indoctrination. Yeah, I agree. Exactly. Yeah. Rachel, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I want to say, I think, I guess I'm questioning my own reliance on, the term craft when I teach creative writing, and thinking about, why I've insisted, on certain craft principles in the past. And I think it's partly because in creative writing has this funny position in the academy anyway. Right? We're we're not a discipline in the same way that other disciplines are. And students, whether they can articulate that or not, are aware of it, right? That the creative there suggests something and separates us from other kinds of courses they take. And so I think craft then becomes a way to suggest that the kinds of comments that we're making, the grades that we're giving, right, are not based on whim, right? That there's something behind them. And I think that was probably particularly something that I clung to as a new professor, as a young female professor, where I felt like, you know, creative writing was kind of, you know, had some sort of marginal position in the academy as a woman. I had a sort of marginal position in the academy too. So I just think it's interesting to think about the kind of life preserver that craft offers, right?
I think that's a really excellent point, you know, because now that I'm trying to expand my thinking on this and consider presenting, you know, lots of more multicultural modes of, you know, approaching craft. I'm also rethinking grading. I'm totally rethinking grading. And you're right. I think it was or has been for me at least, a kind of reliance that, like, yes, there is science, but, you know, science behind what we're doing. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Rachel.
So
well, this is what just a last thought. One reason that I loved the way, Sonya, you talked about helping students think about how their choices align with their intentions, right? So that's a systematic approach. It's not a matter of whim or purely subjective preference. It's science when it's systematic in that older sense of the word science and scientific. And you can adhere to that without having, you know, buying into rigid notions of what's good craft and what's bad craft, and teaching that way. So I really like that.
I think that's critical. Yeah, it's like about equipping the student for accomplishing the goals that they have based on their particular audience, their particular cultural position, their social position, and that's their framework. And it's like, can be the best writer you can be with that as your framework, within that framework. Yeah.
I hate to cut this conversation off because it sounds like we're just really getting to some good stuff here. And I encourage you all to connect and continue the conversation offline as well. I think this concept, Sonya, that you're bringing up, this craft is culturally contingent. I mentioned in the chat, I think it has a much broader application than just creative writing as well. And it really gets at the heart of this anti-racist pedagogy, where I think we need to be very critical about where knowledge has come from, how that knowledge was created, who has been centered in the creation of that knowledge, and be very aware and open of that. So again, I would just like to thank you for this presentation. I want to thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. I am very thankful that you have brought Catherine Standifer to campus last year, I guess I should say. And I want to thank all of our attendees here for being in the room and being engaged in the discussion with us. I hope that you enjoyed listening, and hopefully you were able to take away something that you can use in your classroom and apply as you move forward in this journey of anti-racism. And I just once again would like to remind you that we have more events planned for Black History Month. Again, I'm putting the link in the chat to the event calendar that has everything that we have planned, including our next presentation, which is a continuation of our discussion of Stamped from the Beginning. At 2:30 today, Provost Stacy Robertson will be leading us in a discussion of part 3 of that book. And we encourage anybody to come and join us, whether you have read the book or not. Hopefully we all have something to gain from that. So thank you, Sonya. And again, thank you all. And I hope to see you all at more events this month and beyond.
Thank you for hosting, Dave. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for being here, and thanks for your